Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Get Ready for Game Night, my YouTube channel where I try to teach you some of my favorite games in a casual, unscripted way, just like you're sitting down at the table with me. Please make sure to turn on Klingon subtitles. If I catch any goofs I made after I've posted this video to YouTube, I will correct them using the Klingon subtitles. On this episode, we're going to learn how to play Great Western Trail by Alexander Pfister and published by Eggertspiel. So, let's get ready for game night. Great Western Trail is a game where you are, from the 1,000-foot perspective, just a cowboy trying to deliver cattle from Texas, down here in the lower right part of the board, all the way up to Kansas City, up here in the upper left part of the board. But realistically, it's a very deep, complex, interconnected Euro game where you are having to deal with things like hand management, resource management, a very tight economy, multiple paths to victories, multiple workers that you can hire, and everything you do in the game can affect something else in the game. One thing you'll do during the game is construct your own personal buildings that only you can use. Besides the benefit of being the only player that can use them, and also slowing down your opponents because every piece of cardboard is a space that an opponent must stop on when using their movement points. Every one of your private buildings also has some victory points printed on them. Every time you make a delivery of cattle to Kansas City, you'll have the choice of which city you're going to send the cattle to by train. Whenever you send a delivery to a particular city, like let's say Albuquerque, you'll place your player token on that city. If you now deliver to an adjacent city, for example, El Paso, you've created this link. At the end of the game, you will evaluate every set of adjacent cities to see if you have a token in each, and if you do, you'll gain whatever bonus is printed between them. You may have bonuses that you pick up during the game. For example, by connecting Albuquerque to Santa Fe, you would immediately draw a new objective card. But whenever you see victory points here, those are points you'll score at the end of the game. These are hazards that can be cleared throughout the game by taking special actions. Every hazard tile that you clear, you keep in front of you because they have victory points printed on them. You'll be purchasing better cattle cards for your hand. These cattle cards have victory points printed right on them. So every cattle card you have will be worth points. Throughout the game, you'll be able to advance your train along this track, and at certain points have the opportunity to go off the main track and into the train station. Whenever you're in a train station, you have the opportunity to pay the printed cost here, in this case $4, to place your disc in the train station, which will secure you a certain amount of victory points at the end of the game. Also, when you're in a train station, if you have already hired a worker of some kind, you can sacrifice that worker and have them become the new station master, where you would claim this station master token. This also has victory points printed on it for the end of the game. So let's cover these station master tokens and how they score. This one here says that for every pair of hazards that you have cleared, you'll score 3 points at the end of the game. This says for every worker you've hired, you get 1 point. This one indicates that for every pair of teepees, in which the pair is 1 green teepee and 1 blue teepee, you score 3 points. This is having 3 victory points for every pair of objective cards that you've played during the game, whether you fulfilled them or not. And finally, for every 2 certificates you have at the end of the game, this token is worth 3 points. If you look at your player board, you'll see there are rows where you're going to place the workers that you hire throughout the game. Top row for cowboys, middle row for craftsmen, and the third row for the engineers. For every row that gets to the penultimate step, you'll score 4 victory points, and for every row that gets to the ultimate step, you'll score 4 plus another 4 victory points. The objective cards that you pick up, and remember, everyone starts with one starting objective card for free. If you complete the objective, for example, having a value 3 cattle, a value 4 cattle, and a value 5 cattle in your deck at the end of the game, well, that will score you the amount of victory points printed at the bottom of the card. But be careful, because if you activate these cards and don't fulfill the goal, well, then you'll suffer the negative victory point penalty printed on them. Throughout the game, whenever you make a delivery, you'll be choosing one of your discs from your player board to place out onto the main board, indicating which city you've delivered to. If you're able to unlock this space right here and get rid of that disc, well, that means you've got 3 victory points at the end of the game. And finally, at the end of the game, every $5 that you have, rounded down, is worth 1 victory point. Now, to start the game, you're going to take your deck of cards and draw 4 of them. And that's your starting hand. You can remember that that's your starting hand because if you look right here on your player board, it tells you starting hand is 4. As the game goes on, you'll have ways to unlock larger hands, but we'll get to that later. So this represents the cattle that you have with you in your herd. Here we have 2 jerseys, a black Angus, and a Dutch belt. Ultimately, we want to deliver as good of a variety of types of cattle to Kansas City. Let's talk about how we do that. In order to best understand how all the actions work and how they drive you towards scoring points, I need to show you how the end of your round is going to look like. In other words, what happens when you finally get your little cowboy guy to Kansas City. Technically, I don't think it's called a cowboy because that's what these characters are called, but I always just call him my cowboy. Anyway, so let's say it's your turn and you have 3 movement points, but look, following either path, 1 movement point gets you to Kansas City. You then are going to take 5 steps in a very specific order, and these are non-optional. So let's take a look at those. First, you're going to pick one of these. Remember, these are number 1 tiles that got seeded during the game. You're going to pick either one of these and place it on the board. If you were to choose the green Teepee tile, you would place it in the lowest available spot of the Teepee section. If you chose the hazard tile instead of the Teepee tile, you would take that hazard and place it in one of the 3 hazard areas. In this case, this is an avalanche hazard tile. So it would be placed here in the avalanche hazard area. You can see how the icons match up. All hazard tiles are placed in the lowest numbered space that is not occupied by a hazard tile. So we would go into space number 2. If you ever choose a hazard tile and there are no spaces available, well then the hazard tile you chose is simply discarded from the game. You then move on to step 2 of the Kansas City actions, in which case you will choose one of these workers and add them to the worker market. You can choose either one you wish, and then you must place it in a row that is equal to where the market row token is. In a 3-player game, this far left column is not available. And since there are no spots that are free, you would move this token down to the next space, and this is where the token would go. If, however, on a future turn, this is the scenario, and we were to activate this cowboy, well, you always put it in the row with the market row token in the leftmost available spot. So that's where it would go. You would then evaluate step number 3. The 3rd column, or all of the number 3 tokens up here, could have workers to be added in the market row in the normal fashion, or TP or hazard tiles that would be added to the board in the same manner we added tiles at step number 1. We then go on to step number 4, and this is where we get paid. Hooray! First, we look at what are the cattle cards that are still in our hand. That's what that icon means. If this is our hand here, that's not going to be great for us because you'll notice you have to answer the question, how many non-equal cards do we have? Well, in this case, I have 2 copies of the number 1 jersey card. So one of them is immediately discarded. I then add up what the total breeding value is of my remaining unique cards, in this case 5. I can then add in any certificates I have if I want to increase what the breeding value is. Let's see how that works. When it comes to evaluating certificates, you can have certificates in 2 different ways. Temporary certificates that you pick up as you're going along the trail. Whenever you gain a certificate, you would simply move your certificate marker down 1 space, or permanent certificates that you picked up by becoming station masters. Regardless of which type you have, when you're evaluating your breeding value, you can decide how many of these certificates I wish to add. Well, maybe with my total value of 5, I might want to get that to 6, so I'll just spend 1 certificate. Now, this is a permanent certificate, so I can just declare that my breeding value is now 6, and I might indicate that I've used it temporarily like that. If I wanted to increase it beyond 6, I would then have to start spending my temporary certificates. This would make it 7, and that would make it 8. But for this example, we'll leave it at 6. So between my certificates and the value on my cards, my total breeding value is 6. That's great, because the next step we see here is we collect money. And we collect exactly $1 for every point of breeding value that we have. So I'd collect $6 here. Next, we actually have to make our delivery, which is what we evaluate as the last step in Kansas City. When I decide which city I want to deliver to, there are a few things to keep in mind. The value of the city, if you notice here, Kansas City has a value of 0, Topeka 1, Wichita 4, and so on. It just keeps getting higher as we go to the right. That is the minimum threshold of cattle breeding value that I have to deliver to that city. So, since I had a cattle breeding value of 6, I could deliver to any city up to and including Colorado Springs, because Colorado Springs has a breeding value printed right here of 6. When I choose to make a delivery to a city, I take one of my discs off my player board and place it in the city I'm making that delivery to. Now, when I choose which disc to take off my player board, there are a few restrictions. Notice that most of the discs have this white background, but a few of them have the black background. Every disc that I remove is going to either generate me money, points, or give me more options when it's my turn in the future. However, the black background ones are usually objectively better, scoring me immediate money victory points, making my movement better and my hand size bigger. But I can only remove a disc from a black background space on my player board if I'm placing it in a black background city. So if I wanted to take the disc that has a black background off my player board, I would have to deliver to Albuquerque or El Paso in this example, but I could not deliver to Santa Fe because that has a white background. If you remove a disc from a white background space on your player board, you can place it in a black background city. However, that's usually not going to be a very efficient move. After deciding which city I'm going to deliver my cattle to, I then have to pay shipping costs. Shipping costs are determined by how many of these little red X's do I have to cross to go from the tip of my train to where the city is I just delivered to. In this case, I would have had to go past 1, 2, 3 X's to make a delivery to Colorado Springs. Therefore, I would owe the bank $3. If I don't have the $3 to pay the bank for that delivery, then I would not be allowed to make the delivery to Colorado Springs. There are 2 cities that you can deliver multiple times to. You can put as many of your discs as you wish in Kansas City. However, every disc in Kansas City at the end of the game will net you -6 points. But it will also get you $6 immediately. You're also allowed to have as many discs of your color as you wish in San Francisco, assuming you have the breeding value to get there. You'll notice it's 18. That's pretty high. But every disc you have here is worth 9 points at the end of the game. So for every city except San Francisco or Kansas City, you're only allowed to make 1 delivery per game. Once you're done taking all 5 steps in Kansas City, you would replenish the foresight board. I think that's what that's called. By drawing a tile from bag number 1 to put it into the number 1 empty slot, a tile from bag number 2 to put it in the number 2 empty slot, and a tile from bag number 3 to go in the number 3 empty slot. The last thing you do after making a delivery to Kansas City is you take your meeple and move it back to the lower right-hand corner of the board so you can start the journey again on your next turn. Now, to start the game, you're going to take your deck of cards and draw 4 of them. And that's your starting hand. You can remember that that's your starting hand because if you look right here on your player board, it tells you starting hand is 4. As the game goes on, you'll have ways to unlock larger hands, but we'll get to that later. So this represents the cattle that you have with you in your herd. Here we have 2 Jerseys, a Black Angus, and a Dutch Belt. Ultimately, we want to deliver as good of a variety of types of cattle to Kansas City. Let's talk about how we do that. It's outlined right on the top of your player board, the structure of a turn. Now, the first turn is a little bit different, but we'll talk about how it differs in just a second. You can see if you just follow the top of your board, it tells you how every turn is going to work. Start by moving your player piece a number of spaces, starting at 3, potentially more. Pay money, depending on how many hands you went over or landed on, to the bank if they were on hazard tiles, or to the player itself if you landed on one of their buildings. So let's take a look at how that might work. If the yellow player really wants to get to this building space over here, he has 2 options, as you can see with the 2 different dotted white lines and the small arrows coming out of them telling you which direction you travel. Every piece of cardboard, whether it's a building or a hazard or a teepee, when it's on the board, counts as a space that you must stop at. So because we can move up to 3, we can get to this building either by going 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2. Leftover movement is lost. But remember our hand rule. If we went south, 1, 2, 3, we passed through 2 green hand symbols. That means we would owe the bank $4 because no one owns these tiles. If we went this way, 1, 2, well, we passed through the red player's building. This building has both a green and a black hand symbol on it. Therefore, we would owe the red player $3. Then, if you land on your own tile or a neutral tile, you take the main action or an auxiliary action. If you land on someone else's tile or a hazard or a teepee, you can simply take 1 auxiliary action. And if you end your turn at Kansas City, you carry out the 5 steps of Kansas City. Finally, redraw up to your hand limit. And if you ended your turn in Kansas City, you return your meeple back to the lower right corner of the board to start the journey again in Texas. So let's talk about what some of these upgrade spots are as you start to send your discs off for deliveries. As you can see, every turn you're starting with the ability to move up to 3 spaces, but as you remove these discs, that increases the amount of spaces you can move on your turn. You can unlock these in any order you choose, gaining the above benefit, $3 or 3 victory points, as soon as it's unlocked. At the end of your turn, phase C, you have to redraw up to your hand limit. That hand limit starts at 4, but as you unlock these upgrades, that hand limit increases by 1. Do note that when you increase your hand limit size, you have to pay $5 to the bank. So now that you understand how to score points and how deliveries work once you get to Kansas City, it's easier to understand how all of these actions might benefit you. So we'll take the 6 starting neutral buildings and go over what they can do right now. First of all, building A shows this action. If you discard a white number 2 from your hand, which is a white Guernsey, you would immediately gain $2. You then see a vertical line. The vertical lines on these buildings indicate also. So you may do this, you may also do this second step, and because it's another vertical line, you may also do the third step in this particular building. We'll get to this one later, but if you see a slashed line, that means or. So in this case, you could do one of these 2 actions and then also this action here. You can also take these actions in any order you wish. So you don't have to start with the leftmost action. But for demonstration purposes, let's say that's what we're doing. So we discarded our white number 2 Guernsey and gained $2 from the bank. Now, this symbol means hire a worker from the worker pool. Underneath you see -0. That does not mean you get to hire the worker for free. That just means you're going to pay the regular cost to hire that worker. Because if you then choose to hire an additional worker, you're going to pay $2 extra to hire them. So let's look at the market row to see how that works. When you take the action of hiring a worker, you can choose any worker that is face up in the market row, except any workers that are in the same row as this token. So, for the sake of argument, if there were a cowboy sitting right there, you would not be able to hire this cowboy. The way I remember that is because this token has a great big X in the background, meaning no hires from this row. But anything above this token is fair game. The cost of hiring the workers is depicted to the right of the row. So anyone from this top row is $6, and if you were to take that second action and the tile A, where you can hire a second worker for $2 more, you would have to pay $8. As we scan down the row, you'll notice that sometimes the costs go up from 6 to 7, but other times, we'll move the camera just a bit, the costs go down from 7 to 5. Let's take a look at starting building B. Starting building B says if you can discard a green number 2 cow from your hand, the Dutch belt, and gain $2 if you do so. Additionally, this symbol means you may build a building. When you build a building, in theory, you can build any one of the 10 personal buildings that you have. Remember that everyone has the same set of buildings at the start of the game, whether you're playing with the A side, the B sides, or a mix. However, you are limited into which building you can build depending on how many craftsmen that you have hired. In the upper left corner of every one of your buildings is a craftsman symbol. And you must have at least that many craftsmen in order to construct that building. So at the start of the game, with one craftsman on your board, because even though they're just printed on here and they're not actual tiles, these do count as a cowboy, a craftsman, and an engineer. So with one craftsman, you could only hire one of these buildings here. The cost of building it is printed on the tile that you're building it from. In this case, $2 per craftsman used. So, if we were to say have 2 or 3 craftsmen, well, then we could build this building over here because it costs 3 craftsmen. And it would cost us $6 because we're using 3 craftsmen to do it. I will point out that instead of building a building initially, you can replace a building. So, if we only had 2 craftsmen, say, and a level 2 building already out on the board, we could replace that level 2 building with a level 4, because our 2 craftsmen make up that difference between the initial building and the new one. When you do that, you destroy the old building. You don't get it back, and the new building takes its place. After you've decided on which building to build and you've paid for it, you can place your new building anywhere on the board that has one of these squares. There's a lot of strategy that comes into which building you build and where you put it, because everything you put on the board is another space that you and your opponents have to use when spending movement points to get to your next location. And only you can use your buildings. Other players can stop at your buildings, but they can't use the action of your building. Now, there are 5 locations on the board, 2 at the bottom, and as well as 2 at the top and 1 on the left side, that have these additional actions printed under the spaces. Let's take a closer look at those. Whenever you have one of your buildings on top of one of these special spaces, which by the way are always immediately after some hazard spaces, these are additional actions you can take whenever you land on this building. So if I were to land on this building, I could take the action depicted on it as well as the actions depicted beneath it. In this case, I could discard a black number 1 card to move my certificate marker down 1 space and gain $2. Public Building C has this slash mark, meaning when you activate it, you can either push your certificate marker down 1 spot, or you can pick up a new objective card. When you pick up a new objective card, you simply choose any one of the 4 that are face up, add it to your discard pile, and then it is replaced with a new option. The second half of this tile says that for every engineer that you have, you can move your train forward 1 space. So if we take a look at our player board and we say we have 1, 2, 3 engineers, well, that means we could move our train 1, 2, 3 steps forward. You'll notice that means we crossed one of these red X's, which will make future deliveries a little bit less expensive. While we're here, let's talk about these train stations. When you move to a train station location, you can either simply move along the track regularly, or you can move your train down into the train station. And I'll point out that when you're moving your train, let's say you have 4 engineers and you can move it 4 spaces, that means up to 4 spaces. So you could optionally stop whenever you wish. If you stop in a train station, you now have the opportunity to pay $2 to place one of your discs here And again, notice this is the white background space, so only a white background disc could go here. To earn yourself 1 point at the end of the game. Optionally, if no one else has done it yet, after placing a disc here, you can put one of your workers from your player board, and it must be the rightmost worker from any of the 3 rows, into this location here to claim this Station Master tile. This will give you an immediate benefit on top, in this case a permanent certificate, and an endgame benefit in terms of victory points at the end. Let's talk about Tile D. The first option on Tile D is to either pick up a Teepee tile or pay $2 to move your train up to 2 spaces forward. When you're done with that, or before you do it, you can activate an auxiliary action. And if it's unlocked, it can be a double auxiliary action. Now, we haven't talked about those yet, but we will in a second. Let's cover how these teepees work. When you take a Tipi action, you simply are going to select any teepee that's on the main board and pick it up. The one you pick up, however, indicates the financial transaction that you're going to incur. The 3 teepees in these spots will cost you money to pick up, $1, $2, and $3 respectively. If, however, there are teepees in the lower row, well, when you pick those teepees up, you will gain money. And this is supposed to loosely represent trading with the Native Americans. So we've mentioned auxiliary actions a lot. Let's cover what they are. They're depicted on the left-hand side of your player board. And if only one side of it is open, that means you can only do this as a single auxiliary action. But if through the course of the game you've eliminated some of these discs, well, that means if you choose an auxiliary action that has both slots open, you can use that as a double auxiliary action. So what do? The top action is pretty simple. The single auxiliary action means you gain $1. If you have them both unlocked and can take a double action, you gain $2. This one here says that you may draw a card from your discard pile into your hand and then discard any card to the discard pile. This is a way to cycle through your deck to get that variety of cattle cards that you want when you get to Kansas City. And the double action simply means you can draw 2 cards in and then decide on 2 cards to discard. This auxiliary action allows you to move your certificate down any number of spaces as long as you pay $1 per space and you move your train backwards a space for every $1 you pay. Moving your train backwards may seem like not a great idea. However, sometimes it's advantageous if you want to back in to one of those station spaces, which is allowed. Next auxiliary action is simply paying $1 to move your train forward a space. If it's double unlocked, you can pay $2 to go forward up to 2 spaces. And finally, the last auxiliary action allows you to move your train backwards 1 space and then not discard a card, but permanently remove a card in your hand from the game. This is a great way to cull your deck of those low value cards that don't do you much good, like the level 1 jerseys and the level 2s. Since we're talking about trains and moving forwards and backwards, let's talk about how train movement works with respect to other players. Let's say the blue player can move his train 3 spaces. Well, from 0 to 1 is easy. Now here's where it gets interesting. Whenever there is a train immediately in front of your piece, you behave as though that space does not exist. So his second movement would actually be to number 4, and then 5, and then 6. Optionally, they could have turned down into the station to drop off a disc or put their worker in here to be the station agent. Moving backwards works the same way. If the yellow player were to move his train backwards one step, they would leapfrog the red player to end right there. So no two trains can ever be in the same space, and spaces that are occupied are basically treated like they don't exist. Building E is how you get more cattle cards into your hand. The first half of the building simply says, discard a black level 2 from your hand and gain $2. Then you can go to the cattle market. So the cattle market uses cowboys in a similar way to building buildings uses craftsmen. The cows that you can purchase and how many is determined by how many cowboys you currently have hired. So, first, you have to evaluate how many cowboys you have. In our case, 2. Then, you have to look at what the cost is in cowboys for each type of cattle card that's available. Okay, so if we look at our yellow, red, and blue market, our brown market, and our purple market, we'll notice right here we see if we have a single cowboy, we can spend that cowboy to buy a level 3 card, which all the yellow, red, and blue cards are level 3, at a cost of $6. Now when we spend a cowboy that way, we don't actually lose them. We just simply have a limited number that we can use when we make purchases. So what I like to do is say, okay, we spent 1 cowboy. That cowboy can't be spent anymore for this turn. If we have 2 cowboys, well then we can spend both of them to purchase one of these for simply $3. And if we have 3 cowboys, then we can purchase 2 of those cow cards for $5. Notice the 2 cards depicted here. And that's the basic iconography for how using the cattle market works. If, for example, you had 6 cowboys, well, you could spend 3 of them here, plus $5 to get 2 cards, and then you could spend 3 of them again for $5 more to get 2 more of these cards. The brown and the purple markets work the same, but the cards are more expensive. I will remind you that when you buy a card from one of these markets, you can choose any card that's available. For example, you probably want to buy this 5 Victory Point West Highland before you buy the 4 or the 3. If you look over here, there's this other icon. Say perhaps you really need one of these Ayrshire blue 3 cards, but there are none in the market. If you expend one of your cowboys, you can add 2 more cattle cards to the market. Also related to the cattle market is the fact that it is refilled twice during the game. As the market token gets pushed down as people deliver to Kansas City, when it crosses this threshold, you see this little yellow symbol right here, you will look back at the cattle market and refill it to the total number of cards that was in it at the start of the game. The same thing happens when you cross this threshold. You see the marker there as a reminder. Public building F is a way to get money and to clear hazards. The first half of the card says if you have 2 equal cards in your hand, so for example, if you had 2 brown Swiss, you could discard them from your hand to immediately gain $4. The second half of the card says that you can clear a hazard from anywhere on the board at the cost of $7. So you might look around the board and notice that these avalanche hazards have a lot of victory points on them. You could clear this one for 4 victory points at the end of the game. But maybe you want to clear this one down here by the water hazards. It's fewer victory points, but you've now made it easier to get to your building that's just on the other side of all these hazards, and a little bit cheaper. And building G, probably you can figure out for yourself because we've seen all these icons before. The first half says, for every engineer you have, you can move your train forward 1 space. And the second half says, you can take a double auxiliary action. Remember, you can only take the double auxiliary action if you've already removed the discs that allows you to do the double action. Every time you make a delivery to Kansas City, you're going to be adding more people that you can hire to the market rows. As you hire them, as soon as you get to the space that has the market row tile on it, you'll force it to slide down, and then you'll move on to the next row. The player that actually ends the game is the one that would put a potential hiree token right here, which would force this token off the board. That triggers the end of the game. Every other player would get 1 more turn, but the player that triggered the end of the game takes this token, which is worth 2 victory points. Okay, so that's everything you need to know to start playing Great Western Trail by Alexander Pfister. There are a few more rules. For example, I didn't cover what every single one of your special building tiles do, but you can probably figure that out from the iconography. And there's also a really great reference in the rule book. But if you have any questions, if you catch any mistakes I made, please put them in the comments below. I am really close to 1,000 subscribers. I'm trying to decide what I want to do to celebrate my 1,000th subscriber. If you have any ideas about that, put that in the comments below as well. Anyway, requests, goofs, anything you want to say, just let me know. Hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure you like, subscribe, hit the notification bell if that's what you feel like doing. And as always, thanks for watching.